fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Hello and welcome to a Crimelines bonus episode. I was going to take this week off as I am shifting from the 12 Days of Crimelines Missing Person series to our usual type of content. But I do have a bonus episode for you in this off week. If you've been here a while, you know that once or twice a year, I will do an author and or podcaster interview as a bonus episode. But interviewing isn't really my thing, and interviews aren't what my audience is here for. But I do get a lot of PR inquiries for books, and sometimes they're not even true crime related. So if I'm being perfectly honest, I've largely stopped even opening the emails from PR people. If I know someone who wrote a book, they can just text me and I'll get them on my show, but otherwise, it's just not what Crimelines is about. So all of that to say, the way Dr. Jeffery Smalldon snuck through is that he wrote a book I actually wanted to read. The book title is That Beast Was Not Me, One Forensic Psychologist, 5 Decades of Conversations with Killers. And the book was even better than I thought it would be, probably because Dr. Smalldon's first life plan was to become an English professor. So he actually knows how to write well and to write an engaging narrative nonfiction. I read a lot of true crime books, and this is unfortunately not a requirement to get published, so it's always a relief when it is pulled off. I mentioned Dr. Smalldon's career path because it took a minute for it to lead him to forensic psychology, though the interest was always there. He was the son of an FBI agent, and while he was still an undergrad, as you will hear about in our interview, he started to write to members of the Manson family to figure out how they ended up where they did, and they wrote back. But it wasn't until years later when a double homicide occurred that took the lives of 2 of Dr. Smalldon's coworkers that he decided to pursue forensic psychology in order to understand the minds of murderers. In his book, That Beast Was Not Me, Dr. Smalldon writes about his correspondence and meetings with people you've heard of, like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, and some people you may not have heard of, like Donald Harvey and Thomas Lee Dillon. As you will notice in this interview, Dr. Smalldon is very good at telling a story. He made this interview so easy for me because you just get him started and he's good from there. And as someone who doesn't do interviews, it was very helpful to me. That storytelling ability really translates to the page. I loved in this book how he was able to capture these moments in his life that intersected with killers, but he's doing it with the hindsight that you get after decades of work. It's not a straight nonfiction, here's what happened textbook. It really is a memoir. So go ahead and listen to this interview and then go get The Beast Was Not Me by Dr. Jeffery Smalldon, and I will leave links in my show notes, like always. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about this interview that my listeners might notice is that I only interview authors who are also podcasters, because then if people aren't interested in the book, they might be interested in the podcast. But I got the email from your people and I really wanted to read your book. So I made an exception and I'm really glad I did.
Well, thank you for the exception and thanks for your interest in my book.
It was fascinating. And there's something you said at the beginning that really resonated with me, and I think probably just true crime listeners in general. And you said that you've always been interested in the outliers in life, in society, the people who live kind of differently. And I mean, that's what drew me to true crime, the extremes of human behavior. So that got me into true crime, but you got into it a little bit just from interest in strange people?
Yeah, I think it began that way when I was a kid. I tell the anecdote in my book of going with my family on a trip to Ford's Theater when my dad, who was an FBI agent, was assigned to bureau headquarters in Washington. And I was 8 years old at the time. And I didn't come away with a renewed fascination with Abraham Lincoln or the Civil War. I was fascinated by the 8 people who participated in the conspiracy. And I became kind of obsessed with them. My parents had bought me a book called The Crime at Ford's Theater, and I memorized their backgrounds, like photographically vivid images of all of them in my head 60 years later. So already at that early age, I was, for reasons I'm not sure I can account for, interested in the outsiders, the unusual people, the criminals. And I think one of the reasons that might have developed early on for me is that I had a very peripatetic childhood, a lot like military brats. My dad, back in that day, FBI agents would get transferred every year or two, so we were always on the move. And I used to, for years, when somebody would ask me, what's your most vivid memory of growing up? I would say, and yeah, looking back on it now, I think it's really very poignant. But I was dead serious at the time. I would say waving goodbye to my friends. I just remember a succession of those incidents of waving goodbye to my friends and starting anew, being the new kid on the block, having to make new friends, adjust to new situations. So I think that may have given me an early empathy with outsiders, people who didn't quite fit in. So that may have been part of it. But then across the years of my growing up, it wasn't just like the conspirators and the plot to assassinate the president. It was sideshow performers, celebrities whose mere presence at the margins of my world hinted at some place I couldn't imagine, but I was fascinated with it. I wanted to go there. I wanted to meet those people. I wanted to sample that world. Snake handlers. At a young age, I saw a documentary on TV about snake handlers called Holy Ghost people. And I was so fascinated with that. People who seemed dead serious about drinking strychnine, handling poisonous snakes, speaking in tongues, laying on of hands. And I said to myself when I was a kid, someday I'm going to go there and interact with those people. And I did eventually.
Yeah, I was actually, I really feel like you have a second memoir in you. I don't know if you're working on it, but because this one is very much about where your life overlapped in true crime. I mean, you talk about big cases everyone knows about, like Gacy and Manson, but then also smaller local cases that maybe people haven't heard of. But then kind of at the end, you hint at all these other things you've done. And I'm like, can I read that book? Like, is that one coming out?
I'm starting to do some work on a manuscript that may or may not ever see the light of day. And these are all experiences that find me operating somewhere toward the outer edges of the world my parents had in mind for me. So I'm working on it.
So I might get that book. Okay, I kind of skipped ahead a little bit. We should probably talk about the book you did write and not the one that I want you to write next. Would you say writing to Charles Manson and a few of his high-profile followers was the beginning of you dipping your toe in true crime, or did it start before that?
Well, yes and no. That was the beginning of my attempt to engage with people of like Manson and his ilk. But as I said, I grew up the son of, I always describe my dad as a Hoover-era G-man because I think it conjures a particular image in people's minds, and it's a pretty accurate one. He was an old-school FBI agent, and at the beginning of my fourth grade year, we moved to North Tonawanda, New York, 10 miles from both Niagara Falls and Buffalo. And my dad was in charge of the FBI field office in Niagara Falls. So the mafia was his primary beat because the border was so active in mafia-related activity. And Stefano Magaddino was the Western New York kingpin, and he lived in Niagara Falls, and he was my dad's white whale, kind of. So when I was growing up, I just, like my dad would come home, stop home for lunch and take off his jacket, and he always had a shoulder holster on. And at some point it struck me, I don't think most of my friends' dads wear shoulder holsters. And my dad didn't talk a lot about what he did at work, but Some talk of crime and criminals and the law was in the air that I breathed growing up. One time, my dad was to be part of a surveillance outside the home of Stefano Magaddino. And I knew the name Stefano Magaddino. It was like everybody in Western New York knew that. In fact, my dad had deputized me. At the barber shop where I went to work, my barber was Vinny Spaziani. And my dad said, when Vinny cuts your hair, does he make phone calls? And I said, yeah, all the time. And he said, well, would you report back to me on what he says? So I was deputized in a sense. And I was aware of my dad's activity with the mafia. And this day when he was supposed to do surveillance outside Stefano Magaddino's house, I'm sure he wasn't supposed to do this. He was driving what we always referred to as his work car. But he took me along with him on this particular day. And I was laying down on the floor in the back seat during his hour-long stint outside Magaddino's house. And so he was talking to me without moving his lips very much throughout the whole thing. And just the proximity to Magaddino was exciting to me. And so that's sort of the deep background. But then when I was a senior in college, actually when I was a junior in college, the book Helter Skelter came out, still the best-selling true crime book of all time, about the Manson case. And one thing I often remind people when I talk about this stuff is Manson has kind of passed into popular culture legend. He's been dead since 2017, but he lived a long time after the 1969 murder spree that gave rise to his infamy. But when I engaged with him, it was only 5 years after the trial that resulted in a death sentence for him and others who killed at his behest. But the way that came about, I read Helter Skelter, and I was kind of obsessed with it. I'm a little bit obsessive. And I read it in a single sitting. I couldn't put it down. I started at about 2 or 3 one afternoon, kept drinking coffee all night, and finished it around noon the next day. And I was taking a course in abnormal psychology during my fall semester, my senior year in college. And my professor mentioned in class one day that he had read Helter Skelter. So I thought, okay, this is going to be the day I stay after class and talk with my professor. I'd never done that before. And we did talk in the hallway. And I at some point said, one of the things that really intrigues me about some of those people who followed Manson and did as he commanded is that they came from middle-class backgrounds, not that unlike my own. And from media portrayals of them, you'd get the impression they were automatons who had all but given up free will to act on Manson's behalf. And I said, I wonder if it's a little more complicated than that, if their stories are more complicated than that. And he said, well, have you ever considered writing to them? And no, I'd never considered that. That thought had literally never crossed my mind. Writing to members of the Manson family? No. And so I didn't act on it right away. I let the idea kind of marinate in the back of my brain for a couple of weeks. But then I thought, well, the recommendation or the suggestion came from the person who's taught me what little I know about abnormal psychology. It can't be all that wacky an idea. So I did it. And not only did I write to Manson, but I wrote to the woman who was widely acknowledged as his second in command, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who was not in prison. That's a significant element of this story. She was not in prison. She lived in an attic apartment in Sacramento with her roommate, Sandy Good, another zealous Manson devotee, and they lived not far from Folsom Prison, which is where Manson was imprisoned at the time. So I wrote to Squeaky and Sandy. I wrote to Manson. I ended up writing to Susan Atkins, who was one of the most notorious of the Manson people. I wrote pretty extensively with Tex Watson, another of the Manson murderers. Though to be honest, his letters were so boring because he was a converted Christian, and that's all he wrote about. I couldn't move him off that subject, so eventually I gave up on that avenue of inquiry. But my correspondences with Manson, Squeaky, Sandy, Susan Atkins lasted for the better part of a year and a half. And, it was very interesting. I carried a lot of lessons from that correspondence forward. I think it's important to note that the idea of becoming a forensic psychologist had never entered my mind and didn't enter my mind throughout the entire time that Manson correspondence was taking place. That chapter lasted about a year and a half. By that time, I was in graduate school working on a master's in English. Thought I was going to become an English professor. That was my primary focus at the time. And gradually, those correspondences petered out after a year and a half or so. They took a lot of work to keep them up, and I had a lot of work to do in school. So I thought that chapter was a very interesting one in my life, but I'd kind of left it behind. And then almost a decade later, I decided I didn't want to become an English professor. And so what else was I going to do? I had no clue. And with encouragement from my mom, who was a nurse at the local hospital, I went down to the hospital and talked with one of the administrators. And he seemed like a nice guy. And he said, I'll tell you what you do, Jeff. Go to George Washington, where I did my master's, and then come back and work for me. And I had nothing else going on at the time. It almost sounded like a job offer. I was in my late 20s, and I had no clue what I was going to do. So I applied to one school only, George Washington. Somehow they thought I was some kind of bizarre sleeper candidate or something, because I'd never taken a single business class in my life. I can't imagine they would have seen me as a real strong applicant, but I got admitted and got the financial aid that I needed. So for the second half of that degree, we had to do an administrative residency. I ended up in Columbus, Ohio, at the largest private general hospital in the state at the time. And after my residency year, they invited me to stay on, and I did well. I kept getting promoted. And about 2 years in, I'm at home with my parents in Western New York over Christmas break, and I get a call from the director of public relations. And keep in mind, this is about almost a decade after the Manson chapter. And I get a call from the director of public relations. She says, Jeff, we've had a terrible tragedy. I assumed I had administrative responsibility for a large mental health and addiction services building. So I thought it was something that must have happened in that building. She said, no, Joyce McFadden and Patty Maddox were murdered on Friday afternoon in the research lab between 4:30 and 5 in the afternoon. And I said, what? I mean, no news could have shocked me more. That medical research lab, which had a single door that served as entrance and exit, 6 total employees. I was administratively responsible for it. I knew Patty and Joyce, had in fact gone to their little department Christmas party the day before I left for my parents. And comes this news that they've been murdered, like stabbed 20 times, nobody saw anyone suspicious enter the lab or leave, despite the fact that it was a very bloody crime scene. And I remember thinking at the time, what is going on here? It feels like murder is following me. I mean, I could never have predicted that the hospital where I would end up as an administrative resident and then a vice president eventually would be the setting for the murder of 2 employees in one of my departments. So that event is what prompted me to make the decision to go back to graduate school, work on my PhD, and become a forensic psychologist. And along the way, while I was in graduate school, occurred my interactions by mail with Ted Bundy first, and then both by mail and in person with John Wayne Gacy. They were both on death row. I was looking for information that might help me understand the kind of person who had murdered my 2 coworkers. So those chapters occurred while I was in graduate school, and then came my 25-year career, during which I consulted on close to 300 death penalty cases and did all kinds of other work, too. I consulted on roughly 2,000 child custody cases where I was the court-appointed expert. So that I've sort of set out the rough chronology without getting into much detail yet about the Manson chapter, Bundy, and Gacy, but we can get into those if you want to.
With the Manson thing, when Squeaky Fromm was arrested and the FBI found your letters, because you wrote to her before her arrest for the attempted assassination, did your dad get contacted and them say, why is your son writing to this person?
He did, and maybe I should set the context of that for a little. I wrote Squeaky and Sandy at around the same time I first wrote Manson. And initially, the letters from the women were all peace, love, harmony. Jeff, the companionship you speak of between all of us at the ranch where the Manson family lived was based on love and harmony and so on. And I'm thinking, what? Like Squeaky was Manson's second in command. She didn't commit any of these murders, but she knew all about them. And now she's talking like a hippie flower child. And that's how it started. And then over the course of several months, their letters became increasingly bizarre. And I remember very distinctly when I started to detect an ominous tone. We'd been writing back very cordial, friendly letters. They had asked me for a picture of myself, which I was hesitant to send them because I had visions of one of them showing up on my doorstep. But I talked to a friend of mine about it, and he said, yeah, I would send him a picture of you, but make sure it doesn't look anything like you look. So I sent him a picture that didn't look anything like I looked at the time. And they seemed friendly and so on. And then the beginning of this one letter, the first sentence was, Jeff, we're moving out of the realm of words. I thought, no, I do not want to move out of the realm of words. I'm comfortable there with you, but I don't want to move out of that realm. And they started demanding that I do things. And I knew that these instructions were coming from Manson. They were in very regular touch with him. They wanted me to call up corporation heads who they believed were polluting the environment and so on. The environment was a big cause of theirs at the time. And so I began to think, I might have gotten in over my head here. They're obviously targeting me as a potential recruit, someone to do things on their behalf. And then I knew I needed to find an exit ramp when I got a 16-page handwritten letter from Squeaky's roommate on June 30th. This is 1975. And in it, she renewed the demand that I call certain corporation heads. And she said, try to talk to their wives. And if they seem uncertain about what you're telling them, tell them Manson says. And if they seem confused, say, remember Sharon Tate? And if you don't act on what I'm telling you, soon a wave of assassins will sweep through your home and splash blood from room to room. And I thought, okay, now I need an exit ramp for sure. And that letter went on in even more graphic terms than that for 16 pages. I knew I needed to extricate myself, and I found a way to do that. I won't go into the detail, but it worked. It got them off my trail for that summer. And then the next thing I heard of them was the screaming national news headlines, Squeaky Fromm attempts to assassinate President Ford in a downtown Sacramento park. I remember talking to my dad like the day that occurred. I was at Purdue working on my master's degree, and I talked to my parents, and my dad knew that I'd been writing these letters. He thought I was a little crazy, but to his credit, he never said, you can't do this. He knew what my interest was. He knew I wasn't going to run off to California and join the family. But he said, I don't know what's going to happen here because the FBI is likely to find out that you've been writing to Squeaky Fromm. And then a couple days later, he called me again and he said, my boss called me in today and told me that they'd gotten, at the time, it was teletypes, I think. It was even pre-fax. We got a teletype from the Sacramento FBI saying that they found a cache of your letters in this would-be presidential assassin's apartment. And his name is Jeff Smalldon, and he's using your address. Do you know who this is? And my dad said, yeah, in fact, I do. That would be my wayward son, Jeff. And it turned out really the Sacramento FBI was trying to contact me not because they thought I was some maniac, but they were afraid that Sandy Good, who was not yet in custody, was going to try to contact me, and they wanted to warn me about that. But anyway, that was an awkward moment for my dad.
I'm glad he knew you were writing them and didn't get blindsided with that information.
Well, the weird thing, that summer of 1975, I was living with my parents at their home in Western New York, and it was during that summer that I was getting letters from Manson, Squeaky Fromm, Sandy Good, and they were coming to my parents' address. And fortuitously, I was working as a summer mail carrier. So I'm sure violating some kind of federal law. I would intercept the letters at the post office in the morning so my parents didn't have to suffer the indignity of reaching in their mailbox and taking out a letter with Charles Manson's return address.
So those letters, I think, because it went on so long and then the FBI was involved, that would have been what got you into the forensic psychology. But like you mentioned, it was actually the murders at the hospital, which are to this day officially unsolved, though there is a very good suspect who is deceased. But having a crime hit so close to home inspired you to go back to school? Because you went back to school a few times.
I was an itinerant student.
Yes.
Early adulthood.
So to go back to school and just change your career in such a big way again, were you in your early 30s at that time?
When I began work toward my PhD, I would have been 32.
So, yeah, I mean, that's your second big career change in a pretty short amount of time. Did that feel very overwhelming, or were you just so inspired to do it that you pushed through?
Well, yes to that latter part of your question, but I'll never forget the day I called my parents to tell them that I had made the decision to go back to graduate school and begin work toward my PhD. I had what my parents dreamed of for me, a business job where I wore a suit to work every day. And to them, that meant success. Yeah, I had become a businessman. I was acting in a stable way. And when I called them and said, I think I'm going to go back to graduate school, I always remember not only my mom's words, but her tone of voice sounding much like Eeyore. She said, "Oh, Jeff, like, don't tell me this." But they stuck with me and they supported me. And I didn't make that decision easily, but I decided to go back to work toward my PhD. And that was a monumental decision at the time.
So you've engaged with a lot of killers over your career and even before your career. So, we talked about the writing the letters. You met with John Wayne Gacy, and then you did a lot of interviews with defendants for either their death penalty cases or their appeals. Do you have anyone in all of these hundreds of people that you regret engaging with, either because they were just awful and you wish you never did, or the situation itself just wasn't great or handled correctly?
I don't think anyone's ever asked me that question. That's interesting. I mean, I said that I worked on roughly 300 death penalty cases, and there were certainly people who I came in contact as part of my work that I really disliked being in contact with. They were difficult, threatening in a few cases, not many, but a few. So there were a lot of people who I did it because it was my job, but I didn't enjoy it much. There were other death penalty defendants who I enjoyed working with a lot. One of the things I prided myself on is that I got along with almost everybody, and maybe it says something about me, but I didn't have much trouble relating to even these extremely violent criminals. I don't regret my brief but very interesting exchange of letters with Ted Bundy. I certainly don't regret my 3 years of correspondence and 20 face-to-face hours with John Wayne Gacy. I learned a lot. Sometimes I found Gacy unspeakably weary and narcissistic and difficult to listen to him prattle on. But I learned a lot from my interactions with him, so I certainly don't regret that at all.
One of the things I thought was interesting with your interviews with John Wayne Gacy versus people you would meet within, county jail or state prison is you had way less security meeting with Gacy, where they just put you in a room and was like, bye, versus some of these other people who you met with and there was a guard nearby and they had killed one person versus what we know Gacy has done. So I thought that was kind of interesting that there wasn't more security for you meeting with Gacy.
I did too. It was really upsetting. I mean, when I went to Gacy, after we had talked on the phone a number of times, we'd been corresponding for the better part of a year, when he said, why don't you come out and visit? And I hesitated, but I thought this is probably a rare opportunity for me to sample face to face the behavior of someone who had been convicted of the torture murders of 33 boys and young men. And something I think is important to point out to your listeners is that when I met Gacy, I had never before been in the same room with anyone known to have committed murder, even one murder. And Gacy, as I said, was convicted of 33. So I decided to accept his invitation and go there, but I didn't know what kind of security there would be. He didn't tell me, and there was nobody else to fill me in on that. So when I got there, I was kind of nervous. I didn't know what to expect. I was probably quite a bit nervous because I thought, well, I mean, this guy's obviously got some serious impulse control problems. I was aware that one psychiatrist had testified at his trial that she believed that even had there been a policeman in the same room, Gacy would have killed his last victim. The implication being that he was an out-of-control killing machine. And so I had that in the back of my mind. And as the guard who escorted me to what he called the condemned unit, death row, he took me into a building and up to the second floor, and there was a huge steel gate. And he said, you're going to be meeting with Mr. Gacy on the first room in the right. I said, okay. And he opened the gate. I'm just about to step through. And he says, can I just tell you something before you go to see Mr. Gacy? And I said, yeah, what's that? And he said, well, I know you've traveled a long way to come here to see Mr. Gacy. I also assume you know why Mr. Gacy is on our condemned unit. But I just want you to know one thing. Should something go awry while you're with Mr. Gacy, or God forbid, should a hostage situation develop, you'll basically be on your own. There'll be no prison staff on your side of this gate, and there's a video camera on the wall in the room where you'll be meeting with Mr. Gacy, but there'll be no guards with you in that room or on your side of this gate. Do you understand? And I gulped and said, yeah. What else was I going to say? I wasn't going to turn around and drive 450 miles home after I'd come all that way. But it really got my attention, and it sort of threw me off my game, so I lost my concentration. I had intended to ask him as I was about to go see Mr. Gacy, is there a restroom back here? Because I had about 4 cups of coffee. I knew I was going to need one, but I forgot to ask that question. And later, as I describe in the prologue of my book, about 3 hours into that first day with Gacy, I desperately had to pee. And, I waited as long as I could, hoping there'd be an interruption for lunch or something. Didn't happen. So I finally did what no one wants to do, request a serial sex killer's help to find the restroom. And that was a whole scene. But what the sequence of events that followed my asking Gacy that question told me that I was totally on my own back there. I couldn't even get a guard by yelling for one. So that was pretty sobering.
When it comes to the death penalty, my audience already knows I'm against the death penalty across the board. There are people who challenge that, like John Wayne Gacy. But I do cover some death penalty cases on my show. And what I try to focus on is the aggravating versus mitigating factors, because that is when the jury is really being asked, or the judge in some states, who's worthy of living and dying. And it really comes down to that. And the mitigating factors is largely where you would come in as a forensic psychologist. And I'm just curious what drew you very specifically to that side of forensic psychology. I have friends who are forensic psychologists. They work with sex offenders in prison, which I couldn't imagine. They work training police on risk assessment. They do all sorts of things. But what drew you to death penalty cases?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because it gives me an opportunity to clarify a couple of things about the role that I sought out and enjoyed playing for the most part. And it allows me to briefly mention something I didn't do, which a lot of people assume a forensic psychologist would do. Second thing first, I wasn't a profiler. A lot of people think of, forensic psychologists or profilers, and the fact is that very, very few are. That's something that a couple of people affiliated with the FBI and their behavioral analysis unit do. And that's profiling occurs when the authorities are looking for who might have committed a crime or a series of crimes. And the profiler helps to focus their search by trying to say, we think it likely that the person who committed this crime has these characteristics and so on. My role always came in criminal cases after the authorities had arrested someone, a suspect in a crime or a series of crimes. And the defense, because they were the ones with the client needing to be evaluated, would hire me as their consultant, both to inform them of any issues that might be relevant to the defendant's competency to stand trial or mental state at the time of the alleged offenses. But in death penalty cases, I always knew from the start that my main role was to conduct my evaluation with an eye toward the possibility of the kind of hearing you mentioned, usually referred to as a sentencing or mitigation hearing, where in the first part of the trial, the person has been found guilty. Now it goes on to a phase where, as you said, the jury needs to balance aggravating factors in the crime with so-called mitigating factors, or factors that might convince them that this defendant deserves something other than the death penalty. And that is where I came in. So I conducted all those trial-level death penalty consultations with that thought in mind. One important thing to point out, I think, is that I'm also personally opposed to the death penalty. I knew I was going to have to deal with that issue early on in my career, and I did. It became part of almost every death penalty case where I testified, because the prosecution wanted to convince the jury that I was an anti-death penalty activist and I would say anything to try and get the defendant off, so to speak, and that I was not to be trusted. And the way I handled that was I would have the attorneys who retained me, the defense attorneys, ask me when they were qualifying as an expert witness, Dr. Smalldon, do you have a personal opinion about the death penalty? And it gave me an opportunity to own my personal opinion. I'm against the death penalty. Follow-up question, did that affect how you did your work on this case? No. Had the prosecution hired you as their expert, would you have gone about your work the same way? Yes. Are you here to advocate for the defendant? Absolutely not. Are you here to advocate for the defense cause? No. I'm here to inform this jury of what I've learned about the defendant and through my inquiry about his background. And I think that's a very important distinction, because if I am perceived as an advocate for the defendant or the defense side, then my credibility is blown and I'm of no use to anybody.
It's interesting to do death penalty work. And one of the cases you talked about was the Avery family murders you talk about in the book. It's almost one of the last cases you talk about in the book, but it's one that I've wanted to cover on my show for a while. I haven't. Kids are involved. Those are always harder, so I tend to put them off. But for anyone in my audience who doesn't know, Jeffery Lundgren was a self-proclaimed prophet, kind of cult leader. He committed premeditated murders on a family of his followers who he felt were not contributing to his cause. That's the very short version of what happened. And I think my interest in the Avery family murders, it's just an extension of my fascination with scammers, because cult leaders, they kind of straddle the fence between they're all kind of scammers to some degree, but some of them are true believers in their delusions. So my question is very much just because I'm interested in this case. With a Lundgren, would you characterize him as more of a scammer cult leader, wants their money, wants their following, narcissist? Or did he believe he had all those visions and was a prophet of God?
Great question. And I got involved in the Lundgren case when Jeffrey Lundgren was already on death row. I wasn't involved at the trial level. And the attorney who was representing him in the appellate courts wanted to know whether I thought, based on a new evaluation of Lundgren, the defense should have pursued mental health defense, like insanity, because they didn't at trial. And I ended up writing an affidavit suggesting that I did believe there was a viable insanity defense, that the defense could have proposed to the jury. But I was stuck on that exact question. Jeffrey Lundgren was clearly a con man. He was a manipulator. He was a con man. But that's not all he was. I also believe he was delusional. Well, one of the fascinating things in that case, usually death penalty defendants are given the opportunity, if they're sentenced to death, to make a statement in court. And Lundgren thundered on for 2 days about the Bible. People who were in the courtroom said it was just unbelievable. He just kept going on and on and on. And at one point he said, "Now we come to the children. I know a difficult part of this case." And then he cited the Bible and felt that he had complete justification for doing what he did. And I just found it hard to believe that there wasn't a real conviction behind his claims, in addition to him being an antisocial personality and manipulative and a con man. I also think he was delusional.
A terrible mix of traits.
Well, as I said in my book, I met with his wife, his then wife, Kathy, who they had a child together. And at the time, she was working on a nutrition degree out in Missouri, and she had come to Ohio to visit Jeff on death row. And so Jeff arranged for Kathy and me to meet. And I tell this story in my book. When her car pulled into the gas station, one of those large gas stations along a big highway, to meet me, I noticed that she had a bumper sticker on her car saying, "It's not a choice, it's a child." And I saw that and I thought, what? You're the wife of this guy who murdered 3 children in cold blood in a barn up in northern Ohio? How do you reconcile that? And so about an hour into my interview with Kathy, once I'd been able to establish some rapport with her, I said, "I have to ask you a question, and I hope you won't be offended." And she said, "No, ask me anything you want. I won't be offended." And I said, "Well, I noticed your bumper sticker. It's not a choice, it's a child. Yet you're married to someone who killed 3 children." And she said, "Hi, I know. A lot of people ask me about that. Jeffrey and I are so opposed to abortion. We believe it's so wrong to kill innocent children." And I said, "Well, don't you think a lot of people would say the 3 Avery children were innocent children?" And she said, "Probably, but those people haven't studied scripture the way Jeffrey has." And I just remember thinking, wow, that is really bizarre. And she was very intelligent, well-spoken. And so that was just one other indicator to me that Jeff probably believes this stuff.
That was just interesting because I am drawn to that case and have read about it. A lot of the cases that you talk about were like, smaller ones you've worked on where they didn't get the big national headlines, or they did at the time and now they've kind of faded. And then again, you have the bigger cases that you talked about. So I really enjoyed reading the book. It was great. I'm so glad. Glad I said yes. And it was great talking to you today. I could listen to your stories forever, but I know you don't want to spend all day with me. For my listeners, if, I know they can find the book anywhere. I'll leave all the links in the show notes. But my only question is, where can they find you on social media? Are you on social media to chat or follow there?
Well, I'm on Instagram. I have a website, jefferysmalldon.com. There's a lot of information about my book, my background, and appearances and so on that webpage. There's also a contact function where you can leave me a note, and it's a good way for an initial contact with me. There's also a promotion, get a free chapter of the book that's very easy to sign up for. And by signing up for that, I think you automatically get subscribed to my newsletter, which comes out every couple of months. I also have a YouTube channel with a lot of interviews and so on. So if people are interested in that, that's available as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll leave links to those as well in the show notes so everyone knows where to find you. So thank you so much for giving me some of your time today.
Thank you so much for having me on, Charlie. I've enjoyed talking to you.
It is time for January birthday shout-outs, and I want to send very happy and hopefully warm wishes to my Patreon supporters, Emily, Michaela, Carly, Jasmine, Allison, Tuesday, Nicole, Katie, Gabrielle, Craig, Heather, Angela, Linda, and Christine. Thank you so much for your support over on Patreon, and from me to you, I want to say happy birthday.